Next session interrogates what happens when words break down, when words stop meaning things, when conversation breaks down, when positions are fixed. What do we have left, and how do we bridge that gap? And to have this conversation, we are in the amazing hands of two journalists that have a wealth of experience and expertise covering the Middle East, from Israel, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Libya, who will guide us through this thorny conversation. So I'd love to welcome to the stage Rachel, Shabi, and Ghaith Abdul-Ahad.
Hello everyone, hello Tbilisi, and hello Rachel. So I would like to start with an anecdote. I was in a wedding in somewhere in England, I think, and I'm sitting in front of this gorgeous lady and we're chatting, and she asked me, "Where are you from?" And I say, "I'm from Iraq." And she says, "Oh, my father is from Basra." And I said, "But my father is also from Basra." Then she says, "But my mother is from Kirkuk, a city in the north." I said, "But my mother is also from Kirkuk. Are you my sister or something?" And then she adds, "But they left in 51. And that's when it clicks. That is the decade, I would say, when at one point, there were the third of the city of Baghdad, when all the Jews of Iraq fled, were forced to flee, and forcibly kind of lost everything, confiscated. And that's the story of friendship, of two Iraqis trying to come to an understanding of what happened to our country, to the region. Rachel, just last year, was published one of the most beautiful books to read and one of the most difficult conversations at this time to have. So, Rachel.
Thanks so much. What a lovely introduction. I should say that at that time, I didn't actually know I was sitting in front of Ghaith because you know what it's like with journalists who don't look like their byline photos. Guilty. So I hadn't twigged that it was him, and of course, I'd been following his work from Iraq for decades. And I was such a fan of the way that he brought to life the devastation of the war on Iraq following the US-led invasion, and the devastation on people, and the fact that there's the war, and there's the bombs, and there's the people who are killed by bombing and through injuries and all the rest of it. And then there's the death by 1,000 cuts of a country that you illustrated so well. And I have really strong memories of reading you. And sometimes I go and see my parents, as we say, we're both from Iraq. And during that invasion, and I could see, we'd listened to World Service and the reports from Iraq, and I could see their faces just crumpled and the devastation. And for some reason, I heard that texture in your writing as well. So there was something deeply familiar about it. My parents, at one point, I remember them, it was after the invasion, and we were listening to World Service, and amid the injustices, they said, "Look, if you're going to invade and occupy a country, you should at least be able to pronounce its cities right." Because time and again, there'd be these mispronunciations and manglings of Iraqi cities on British media at the same time that Britain was occupying Iraq. So all of that is a long way of saying that it's been such a pleasure to be in this conversation with you about all of these things since that wedding. And I look forward very much to being in this conversation with you now.
Tell me, Rachel, why did you want to write about anti-Semitism at this point?
I mean, first of all, I didn't want to write about that at all. I mean, why would you? It's a dumpster fire of a conversation. And I should say that, this was not my beat I was not an expert. I hadn't been reporting it. I hadn't studied it. I hadn't researched it. I was going about minding my own business, doing other things. I reported from Israel-Palestine for 5 years. I wrote, long reads to The Guardian about many other social justice issues. And anti-Semitism wasn't something that I wrote about, except in the context of Israel-Palestine and the way that Israel had sort of mobilized a political misuse of anti-Semitism claims to shut down Palestinian advocacy. So that was the context I wrote about it, until I was following British politics. I was based in the UK. I was reporting on the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, who'd become the Labour Party's leader in late 2015. And, he was a socialist, and he was a big ally of Palestinians, and both those things are relevant. And I think the whole sort of the patient zero of it all that got me thinking, all right, something's weird about the way this subject is playing out in our progressive conversations. It was when Ken Livingstone, who was the former Labour mayor of London, he was a brilliant mayor, and I really admired him for a long time. And he was on talking, there was some sort of claim of anti-Semitism that he was responding to amongst the Labour leadership. And he started talking about Hitler and how when Hitler first came to power, which I think was 1932, this is, what, 3? Ken Livingstone said, all right, fact check, 33. Thank you. He said, at first, Hitler's plan was for all the Jews to go to Israel. And then he said something like, so he initially supported Zionism before he went mad and killed 6 million Jews. And I think for a lot of us, listening to this, we were like, wait, what? He was what now? And for me, it was also a red alert that, people say you should never meet your heroes. I feel like you should never ask your heroes for their pet theories about Hitler. That's never going to go well. So that was the start of what pulled me into this scenario whereby progressive politics was constantly flawed and undermined by confusion and misunderstanding and an inability to talk about anti-Semitism in the way that they would talk about other racisms and cohere it around an anti-racist struggle, coupled with their political opponents realizing that it was the perfect wedge with which to divide and topple, essentially, progressive movements because they didn't know how to handle it. And then alongside that was a very effective way in which the far right was using, pretending to care about Jews and pretending to care about anti-Semitism as a way to rehabilitate their own political fortunes. I'm thinking of Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Marine Le Pen in France, or Nigel Farage in the UK, who would use this as a way of gaining political momentum and also mainlining their own political obsessions, which was hating Muslims and hating migrants, right? So this whole combination of things was such a hellscape. I thought, well, let me just wade in.
At a time which is, at any time, wading into the issue, the debate of anti-Semitism is a Pandora's box. And I remember when we're having a chat in London and you're saying, I'm going to write about this, and my first initial reaction was to go hide under the sofa or the table, because this is going to be opening such a debate. One of the most amazing things that you talk about in the book is the color off-white.
Yeah.
How do you define the subtlety in the racism growing up in England, being Jewish, looking from the outside as white as everyone else, but you're not there? So I would love to hear your points equating anti-Semitism with the racism because, what was the it was also a Labour MP, I think, who had this, when she was talking about racism in general.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyhow, so tell me about anti-Semitism versus racism and why there is no one big alliance of everyone, all progressive together.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. By the way, your response was the same as many of my friends who, when I said I'm going to write this book, I might as well have said, I'm going to jump into a vat of hazardous waste material. They were like, why? Why would you want to do this? And I think Off-White is this idea of Jewish people. So first of all, there are lots of Jewish people who, unlike me, there's black Jews, there's brown Jews, there's a lot of people who are not coded white, and they get completely erased from this conversation. So just to bring them back into the picture, half my extended family would not pass as white, as family that come from Iraq. The category of Off-White is this idea that Jewish whiteness is contingent, and it's actually historically quite late in the day that Jewish people became white. Jews have been not white or other or racialized for longer than they were absorbed into whiteness, which pretty much happened after the Second World War. Particularly, you notice this in America, in the US, where you can see a sort of not only a rapid absorption into the category of white, but also now that you're white, you can help us be racist towards the non-whites, the black people, so as a way of upholding their whiteness. So it speaks to that, but what it also speaks to is the idea that actually all of these racisms, whether we're looking at anti-Semitism, anti-black racism, Islamophobia, the origin story of all these racisms is Christian Europe. And because racism is not a very original business, and racists are not very original people, you can see, once you start looking into the history of anti-Semitism and anti-black racism particularly, there's a lot of overlap. They're basically copying notes from each other. So the systems and the architecture that was used to persecute and demonize Jews in the sort of medieval period in Europe, which was when, anti-Semitism was really coming to the fore, and there was the blood libel and all of the rest of it. You can see that the architecture of that was then traveled across the Americas at the time of slavery. And that sort of logic of what is it that makes you other? How can we racialize you? In the case of black people, how can we invent the category of black in order to denigrate and therefore enslave, colonize, and extract from you? It was the same architecture, it was the same thinking, and then it bounced back again. So that mechanism went on to inform the Jim Crow rule, which was a way of reproducing slavery after slavery. It was a way of maintaining white supremacy after slavery in America. And then when Hitler wanted to persecute Jewish people, when he was not pro-Zionist, and never was, he looked to Jim Crow. He looked to America for quote-unquote inspiration for how to do that. And of course, he didn't end up with the one-drop rule that was defining slavery, but he ended up with something very similar, which is, having a Jewish grandparent was enough to consign you to the death camps. So you can see they're constantly in conversation with each other. They're constantly borrowing from each other. And you realize through that how contingent these categories are, how whiteness isn't really a thing, but also how it makes absolutely no sense to be fighting racism in the silos that were created by racism in the first place.
I mean, one of the things that you face as a minority anywhere in the universe is this note that when people talk about so-and-so, well, so-and-so, although he is Arab, Muslim, Jew, black, he's such a good person, or something like that. Did you see this kind of growing up in England? This, oh, Rachel, she's such a good person, although she is ABC.
I mean, I have to be honest and say growing up was quite weird in the UK because people didn't really know what to make of us. I mean, it was hard to tell whether, I mean, this was, you know, in a small town. This wasn't in a big city. It wasn't in London. And there wasn't that much diversity. And so it was hard to figure out whether people thought we were weird because we were Jewish or whether people thought we were weird because my parents were, you know, Iraqi and spoke Arabic like you do. And, you know, came across as, we're not quite sure what you are because we can't be bothered to categorize you, but you're foreign and we're not really sure what to do with you. So it was quite difficult to make out what it was that they were having a reaction to. But I can tell you that for sure that category exists in the current moment where, so the Jewish equivalent of that would be, and I'm sure there are variations that you can talk about, the Jewish equivalent of that would be, you know, the good Jew who says the right things about Palestine and, you know, is litmus test approved, and then everyone else who is a bad Jew unless they, you know, reform their ways and join the good side.
So one of the, I was trying to avoid I was looking at the watch and trying to, this is the biggest thing we talk about. It's not we're talking about anti-Semitism in abstract. We're not talking about the history of anti-Semitism. We're talking about anti-Semitism in the moment of what's happening in Palestine and Gaza and apartheid that's taking place and that thing. But before, just like a tiny little thing, I think personally, as an Iraqi, I think the tragedies of Israel, Palestine, of all what's been happening, has also another side of it, which is, you know, as I said, Baghdad was at one point in the 1920s 30% Jewish, and we had this conversation before in a way because they had access to Europe, to Alexandria, so a lot of modernity came to Baghdad through the Jewish community of Baghdad, and then suddenly that part of your history is wiped out. No one can talk about the Jews of Baghdad anymore because in Iraq, the Jews have been equated with Israel, suffering, all of that thing. So even before the moment of Gaza, that's been taking place in dishes, Iraqi dishes have disappeared because the Jews left and took the dishes with them. So my point is, I would like to, so Rachel is, before the book, Rachel is this progressive journalist, writes about Palestine, Israel, long before this became the topic of the day and to talk about it. How did this anti-Semitism manifest its form in this current moment, in the Gaza moment? How do you negotiate that this is bad, but that doesn't mean this? How do you do that? How do you wake up in the morning and look into social media and decide, no, Tucker Carlson cannot be an ally of mine?
Tucker Carlson can never be an ally, ever. Yeah, it's really difficult. Open social media, close it back down again, usually. It's really difficult in this moment. And, you know, you're right that the bit that is erased because neither side wants to forefront it is the story of the Arab Jew, like my parents. And, you know, I remember quite viscerally, my mum died of old age last year, and she was the last on both sides of my family who were born and raised in Iraq. And there was a part of me that was thinking, but who's going to tell that story now that that generation is gone? Who's going to maintain that culture? But also, who's going to be the living, breathing, walking, talking rejection of the idea that the Arab world and the Muslim world are somehow endemically, historically anti-Semitic, right? Who's going to counter that narrative just by the fact of their being and the fact of their living in these places where, you know, relative to Europe at the time, it was just not a feature of life. You know, the Zionism that created Israel could never have been formulated in Iraq. It had to be invented as part of European thinking and imbued with European colonial thought, and as a response to the rampant anti-Semitism of Europe. There was none of that. Those conditions did not exist in Iraq, across the Middle East. So for me, that bit is really important, because now what we're seeing in the conversation, and particularly around Gaza, it's been really full-fronted. This idea that, you know, so European countries, anti-Semitism is coming in through migrants, you know. And you've got a country like Germany with a straight face, Germany. You know, the German chancellor saying, yes, the problem we have with anti-Semitism is because of the migrants. And you're like, you're Germany. you cannot say that, you know. And the reality, of course, confirms that most of the most of the violent anti-Semitic attacks in Germany are coming from the far right. Surprise. So to reject that story, I think Arab Jews have a really prominent role to play in this current moment, just to challenge those binaries, reject the narratives around anti-Semitism that are being imposed on us, on communities, on Muslim and Jewish communities, by political actors with political motivations and ideologies that we do not agree with, that we actually reject outright. So for me, the whole experience of being an Arab Jew, in that context of how we tackle anti-Semitism, that is a huge and essential part of it. And to just keep pushing back at this erasure of the narrative of the Arab Jew, also, by the way, the narrative of the Judeo-Islamic culture and heritage, which is the actual heritage. Judeo-Christian is not a thing. It's not a category. It has no meaning culturally, religiously. So just to sort of reassert Judeo-Islamic culture, which has also been erased and disappeared, to me that's really important, to muddy and challenge the narratives that you're talking about and that we see every day when we open social media.
And one of the things that you also write about beautifully in the book is this whole how anti-Semitism been used by Israeli far right to, while Netanyahu had a very good relationship with Viktor Orban, at the same time using this label of anti-Semitism to crush any criticism, dissent, voices that being raised against what's happening in Gaza and everywhere. How is that also an exploitation of the label of anti-Semitism and taking away the true meaning of it?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and I think, you know, it brings me to the meta-narrative of all this, which is, you know, the right wing have no business talking about anti-Semitism. Progressives have created a vacuum by not talking about it for so long. I'm not saying for bad reasons, sometimes for understandable reasons, but we basically need to reclaim that conversation, take it away from the far right, and actually integrate it and cohere it into our collective anti-racist struggle. Because the far right have no business talking about defending Jewish people and pretending to fight anti-Semitism. But that mechanism that you're speaking about is something that Israel developed as a strategy of making alliances with authoritarian rulers, leaders across Eastern Europe, because alliances with them would be helpful in sort of EU context, for instance, where the EU is trying to mobilize laws against, say, Israeli settlements, and then you get countries like Hungary veto blocking it. And so, writ large, what that means is, actually, you can be as anti-Semitic as you like. Israel doesn't care, as long as you support Israel. And that's the other thing that makes this so complicated, is that the hypocrisy of it, of like, okay, so all these far-right people who are regularly spouting anti-Semitism, that's completely fine because they support Israel, right? And the other element of that is that what you see happening is that it takes away the next step of that, which is to remove the Jewishness of people who are not supportive of Israel. So you're like the wrong kind of Jew. And my favorite version of that is when the former Trump attorney and former New York Mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, he said about the billionaire philanthropist and Hungarian Jew, George Soros, he said, yeah, he's not really Jewish. I'm more Jewish than he is. And you're like, that's not a thing. That's not how it works. But what he meant was, he's pro-Israel, therefore he's more Jewish. And that kind of revisionism is another thing that, this book tries to push back on.
Can I ask a slightly difficult question? In the aftermath of Gaza, there was this whole, whenever someone comes on TV or on the radio, writes Arab and Muslim or something, the first question is, do you condemn Hamas? And then that would be the starter of the conversation. Is there something like this happening on the other side? Like, your name is Rachel Shabi, and the first question, do you condemn, and so you prove your progressiveness and your human values? Do you have to be a representative of that?
I think that what you're speaking to is really important because I see it happen all the time to Palestinians and to Arabs and Muslims who appear on TV supporting or speaking on behalf of or in solidarity with Palestinians. And I can see that it is harder for them, objectively harder, because of the constant haranguing that they get around this question. Will you condemn Hamas? Do you think this? Is this terrorism? Like, before they even get to say what they think, is just being stonewalled by all these questions. And it's harder. It's harder for, I see friends of mine experience this. And this block is especially egregious when it's, Palestinians, sometimes with family in Gaza, right, who are trying to explain, trying to narrate the reality of the situation in Gaza for their families, for their friends, things that they know about. And it just gets disrupted by this, do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn October 7, et cetera, et cetera? And I don't get that. So it's objectively harder. I get some version of, aren't you supposed to fall in line with this Israeli narrative of what antisemitism is? But, I clearly don't. So that's really as far as it goes.
To go back to this idea of writing this book at this exact moment of time, of course, it's far more difficult. It's far more, there was never easy time to kind of write about this. How do you see it today? And again, in light of Gaza, to have this conversation. Can you even have this conversation with people?
It's so hard to think about that. And I really struggled with it at the time as well. I'd been working on the idea of the book for a few years. And then it was commissioned. It was signed in August 2023. And then October 2023. And it was really difficult. It was like, is this the best use of my time and energy? Should I be doing this now? But then in the months that followed, I could see that every single narrative that I'd been talking about was just amplified. So the way that it went into overdrive, that you could not make any criticism of Israel, that, it didn't matter whether you were a pop star or a Swedish climate campaigner or the UN or whoever, anything you said that was critical of this genocidal war in Gaza was you're anti-Semitic and you support Hamas. One or the other, or sometimes both, right? And then the way the far right was just having a field day with this moment, totally mobilizing and cohering around support for Israel and this sort of clash of civilizations narrative that they love, because again, it gives them a chance to bash Muslims and Islam, which is their main focus at the moment, along with bashing Muslims, migrants. And then you could see the progressive left just like fall into these elephant traps of like avoidable mistakes of just, you know, there are conversations that could so easily be averted with slightly more understanding and slightly more of an eye towards widening the collective tent of support. And then, you know, all these conspiracy theories that went rampant because it's like everyone's looking at this situation and thinking, well, why is Israel getting away with these horrendous atrocities that we're seeing live streamed on our phones every single day? How does Israel get away with this? And absent an analysis of power, absent an analysis of the idea that, well, because it's the client state and because this is useful for Western allies, not just in terms of security and intel and geopolitics, but also financially, absent that analysis, there's a vacuum into which all sorts of conspiracies around Jewish power fall, and that's what we've seen as well.
And it's so easy. It's so easy just to blame it on the Jews.
Well, yeah, it's an easy reach.
So here's, I know I have to allow questions, but I have the one last, which you write about again in a very vivid way in the book. How to build an alliance that includes all these anti-racist, I don't want to even use the word anti-racist movements. Why doesn't the left achieve that progressive golden goal of containing all of that in one alliance?
Just because we love a fight. Well, I think there's a couple of things. It goes back to this analysis of power that I was talking about before, of like, this isn't Israel controlling the world, right?
Let me paraphrase. What do we need to do to achieve that alliance?
Okay, so I think we need to, that's a better question. Let's make it positive. I think we need to pan back and see that this isn't I don't like to use conflict because it seems inadequate in the face of what Palestinians are experiencing every day. This isn't between sides of minorities, of Muslims and Jews, or Arabs and Jews, or whatever. This is a situation created by the powers that made those sides in the first place and put them in antagonistic situations in the first place. So panning back the camera far back to the Christian Europe that is responsible for all the racisms that are now playing out and that were the backdrop for the situation that we have now. So the Europe that's responsible for the Holocaust, that created the conditions for the narrative of a Jewish homeland to become inevitable. The Europe that was responsible for the racism that closed its doors to Jewish refugees from Europe precisely at the time when it was needed, i.e. during the Third Reich and after. The Europe that was responsible for the anti-Black and Islamophobic and anti-Arab narratives that we see that make people not necessarily understand the humanity of Palestinians with quite the significance or the reality that they should. The Europe that has been emboldening and supporting and complicit with one side because it's advantageous to them for all kinds of reasons. And not least in this story, the Arab Jews that we're talking about, the Europe that also had a part to play in the reason why those hyphenated Arab Jewish identities collapsed in Iraq, in Egypt, in North Africa under the French, Iraq under the British. So pan back wide enough to see the origin story of that, and then cohere in a collective anti-racism that doesn't see Palestinian liberation as being in conflict with a struggle against anti-Semitism.
Beautiful. Questions, please. You're getting a mic. One second.
Thank you. So to push back a little bit against the Christian hegemony narrative, my question is kind of why the Jews were pushed out of Iraq in the first place, and what Iraqi society today is like, independent of Christian influence or European influence, because I think there's a common thread, even meta beyond just like European history, of how minorities are displaced and mistreated. That's not just unique to Europe. That's beyond like Edward Said's Orientalism. It's universal and like goes to like the root of good and evil.
I feel like that's partly a question for you.
So, where do we start? My friend? Look, you can't isolate. It's not the Iraqis one morning. I mean, of course, in every society, as I said, I grew up in Iraq, I live in Iraq, there's always this thing, oh, so-and-so is such a good guy, although he wears a black t-shirt, a blue t-shirt. So there's always this narrative that exists that differentiate between people, society, Sunni, Shia, Muslim, Christian. Within the Christian communities of Iraq itself, there is this whole racism going on. So, but you can't differentiate that between, or separate that from the whole bigger issue of colonialism that happened in Iraq. Avi Shlaim, who amazingly writes in his book about growing up in Iraq as a Jew in Iraq. And then, of course, no one remembers that, as Rachel was saying, kind of no one can go back into history. Now, everything is wrapped into this whole narrative of Israel, and in Iraq, of course, we have the American invasion wrapping into this, and the idea of resistance becomes resistance against the Americans, against Israel, against all these things. So at the moment, you can't have this kind of conversation at all in Iraq. But please, you...
No, I can't add to that. I think that was a great answer. And I do think that those mechanisms, it wasn't only that, and you can't isolate exactly as you said, but those mechanisms of elevate a minority within a society in order to control the whole, that mechanism, divide and rule, is a well-worn mechanism for colonizers everywhere.
And one of the very few things that I've learned recently, I mean, the decision to expel the Jews out of Iraq in 48 after the establishment of the State of Israel, or make living conditions so impossible that they are forced to leaving everything behind, was issued by a very pro-West, pro-British Prime Minister of Iraq, who accused the Jews of Iraq at that time of being a tool of the Communist Party, because the founder of one of the leaders of the Communist Party was a Jewish thing. So it is the pro-West element in Iraq society at that time who enabled the expulsions of the Jews. Nurisai?
Yeah, absolutely. Although, Jews were in the communists and socialists. I mean, that wasn't a lie. They were far more likely to be communists and socialists than they were to be Zionists. For example, they identified much more as Iraqi nationalists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Questions? No questions? Yes, one question to the...
Yes.
Oh, no question? I was just raising a hand. Okay, then. I think we have no questions. Last call. Yes, one question over there.
Is asking. I have a comment, actually, not a question. It's interesting that you mentioned that Zionism could not have happened in the Middle East. I mean, I'm from Georgia, and we pride ourselves on the fact that there was no antisemitism in Georgia. And I was just thinking that it was perhaps because we had this sort of Middle Eastern attitude towards Jews rather than the European attitude towards Jews. And when the anti-Semitism did happen, it was after the Russians came and during the Soviet Union also, because some of the anti-Semitism of the Soviet Union, counterintuitively, was because many Bolsheviks were Jews. Just a comment, and maybe you care to comment on that as well. Thank you.
I think that's a fascinating point, and I want to note only, I'm really glad you mentioned it. I just want to note that I think that the original Georgian Jews, i.e. before the arrival of the Ashkenazi Russian Jews, I think there is an idea that they were, like, they're ancient, they've been around for thousands of years, and they were part of the community that was expelled from Jerusalem. So that was the same time that the Iraqi Jews were expelled, exactly the same time. They ended up in Iraq, the Georgian Jews ended up in Georgia. So it's like the same bunch of rebels fighting and then losing in Jerusalem and being banished.
Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we still have a project to do, like rediscovering Iraqi dishes, Iraqi Jewish dishes, and reintroducing that to the Iraqi cuisine. In the meantime, thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you so much.